Margaret Sullivan thought she was making a simple administrative decision when she walked into Riverside Elementary that Monday morning. The veteran teacher displays in the main hallway had been there for years. Faded photographs, worn military patches, and a collection of small American flags honoring local heroes. But as the newly appointed principal of this suburban Chicago school, Margaret saw something different, a potential lawsuit waiting to happen. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. What she didn't anticipate was that her decision to remove those displays would ignite a firestorm that would bring 1,000 military families to her doorstep, transform a quiet neighborhood into a battlefield of principles, and force an entire community to confront what it truly means to honor those who served. This is the story of how one woman's interpretation of school policy nearly tore apart everything a small town held sacred. The October rain drummed against the windows of Riverside Elementary as Margaret Sullivan made her final walkthrough of the building. 3 weeks into her tenure as principal, she was still discovering corners of the school that needed attention. The previous principal, Harold Brennan, had retired after 38 years, leaving behind a building rich with tradition but desperately in need of modernization. Margaret paused in front of the memorial hallway display case. Inside, weathered photographs of local veterans smiled back at her, some in crisp dress uniforms, others in combat fatigues stained with desert sand. Small American flags no bigger than index cards were arranged around each photo. A handwritten placard read, "Riverside Heroes, our community's finest." She frowned, pulling out her phone to photograph the display. The school district's updated policy manual, which she'd been studying religiously since her appointment, was clear about political displays on school property. The separation of church and state extended to patriotic symbols that could be interpreted as government endorsement of military action. Recent court cases in neighboring districts had cost taxpayers hundreds of thousands in legal fees. Margaret had earned her position through careful adherence to policy and procedure. At 42, she was the youngest principal in the district's history, chosen specifically to modernize Riverside Elementary's approach to education. The school board had been explicit: avoid controversy, focus on test scores, and keep the district out of legal trouble. The next morning, she called Tommy Rodriguez, the school's maintenance supervisor, into her office. Tommy had worked at Riverside for 15 years, ever since he'd returned from his second deployment in Afghanistan. His weathered hands still bore scars from an IED explosion outside Kandahar, and he walked with a slight limp that became more pronounced during Chicago's harsh winters. "I need you to remove the veteran display from the main hallway," Margaret said, not looking up from her paperwork. Tommy shifted uncomfortably in the plastic chair. "Ma'am, that display's been there since I started working here. Maybe longer, I understand, but it's not in compliance with current district policy. We need to maintain neutrality on political matters." "Political matters?" Tommy's voice carried a note of confusion. "Those are just photos of local guys who served. My buddy Jake Peterson is in there, lost his leg in Iraq. Mrs. Henderson's son Michael killed in action in Syria. These aren't political statements, Principal Sullivan. They're neighbors." Margaret finally looked up, her expression sympathetic but firm. "I appreciate the sentiment, Tommy, but the law is the law. Recent court decisions have made it clear that displays like this can be interpreted as government endorsement of military action. The school board is very concerned about potential litigation." Tommy stood slowly, his jaw working as he processed her words. "So you want me to throw away pictures of dead heroes because some lawyer might have a problem with it? I want you to carefully pack everything and store it in the basement. This isn't about disrespecting anyone. It's about protecting the school district." After Tommy left, Margaret felt the familiar knot of anxiety that had been her constant companion since taking the position. Every decision seemed to carry the weight of potential controversy. She'd already fielded complaints about the lunch menu, the playground equipment, and the morning announcements. The last thing she needed was a legal battle over a display case. By noon, word had spread through the school's tight-knit staff. Jennifer Walsh, the fourth-grade teacher whose father had served in Vietnam, knocked on Margaret's door during her lunch break. "Principal Sullivan, I heard about the veteran display. Is it true you're having it removed?" Margaret gestured for Jennifer to sit. "It's a precautionary measure based on updated district policy. I know change is difficult, but we have to follow legal guidelines." Jennifer's composure cracked slightly. "That display has been a source of pride for our students. Every Veterans Day we have former servicemen and women visit our classrooms. Kids write thank you letters to the families of those featured in the display. You're not just removing photos, you're erasing a tradition that connects our students to their community's history. I understand your concerns, but we can find other ways to teach respect for military service that don't potentially violate the Establishment Clause." Jennifer stood, her voice rising. "We're talking about honoring people who died for this country, not promoting a religion or political party." Margaret remained calm, though she felt the conversation slipping away from her. The courts have consistently ruled that government institutions, including public schools, must remain neutral on matters that could be seen as political endorsement. Military displays, while well-intentioned, fall into a gray area that could expose the district to legal liability. Jennifer left without another word, but Margaret could see the anger simmering beneath her professional exterior. Within hours, the story had spread beyond the school walls. Parents began calling, asking if the rumors were true. Margaret found herself repeating the same explanation over and over: policy compliance, legal liability, district neutrality. By Wednesday, Tommy had reluctantly removed the display. The hallway looked sterile now, empty case reflecting fluorescent lights where once proud faces had gazed out at passing students. Margaret told herself she'd made the right decision, even as she noticed how quiet the building had become. The first real sign of trouble came Thursday afternoon. Sarah Mitchell, president of the Parent-Teacher Association, requested an emergency meeting. Sarah's husband, Captain David Mitchell, was currently deployed in Kuwait with the Illinois National Guard. Her 8-year-old son attended Riverside, and she'd been one of Margaret's strongest supporters during the hiring process. "Margaret, I need to understand your reasoning," Sarah said, settling into the chair across from the principal's desk. "That display honored local heroes. My husband's photo was in there. He's serving his 3rd deployment. How do you justify calling that political?" Margaret had prepared for this conversation. Facing Sarah, whose husband was literally risking his life overseas, made her practiced words feel hollow. "Sarah, I appreciate your family's sacrifice more than you know. But the legal landscape has changed. Districts like ours have been sued for maintaining displays that could be interpreted as government endorsement of military action." "Government endorsement?" Sarah's voice was incredulous. "We're honoring individuals who chose to serve, not promoting war. There's a difference between supporting troops and supporting policy. The courts don't always make that distinction. One lawsuit could bankrupt our school's programs. Art classes, music programs, sports, everything could be at risk if we face a major legal judgment." Sarah leaned forward, her expression intense. "So you're willing to dishonor dead soldiers to protect the art budget?" The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. "That's not fair, and you know it. I'm trying to protect this school and everyone in it by erasing the memory of people who died protecting it." After Sarah left, Margaret sat alone in her office as afternoon shadows lengthened across her desk. She'd expected resistance, but the raw emotion in both Jennifer's and Sarah's voices had shaken her. She pulled up the district policy manual again, rereading the sections on political displays and religious neutrality. The language was clear, not particularly nuanced. Her phone buzzed with a text from her superintendent. "Dr. Robert Henley, hearing some concerns about policy changes at your school. Let's talk tomorrow." Margaret stared at the message, feeling the walls of her office closing in. She'd been hired to modernize and protect the school, but every decision seemed to generate more problems than it solved. Outside her window, she could see parents gathering for afternoon pickup, their conversations more animated than usual. She thought about Tommy's scarred hands carefully packing away the photographs, Jennifer's trembling voice as she defended a beloved tradition, and Sarah's accusation that still echoed in her mind. Perhaps there was a middle ground she hadn't considered. a way to honor the community's values while protecting the district's interests. But as she watched more parents cluster in heated discussion near the school entrance, Margaret realized that middle ground might already be impossible to find. The decision had been made, the display removed, and the community's reaction was building like storm clouds on a Chicago horizon. What she didn't know was that Sarah Mitchell had spent the previous evening making phone calls to military families throughout the region, and that a movement was already forming that would soon bring national attention to the small town of Riverside and its embattled elementary school. The first domino fell at 6:47. And on Friday morning, when Sarah Mitchell's post went viral on the Riverside Community Facebook page, she'd written it at midnight after tucking her son into bed, her fingers trembling with exhaustion and rage as she typed, "While my husband serves his third tour overseas, our elementary school has decided his sacrifice, and the sacrifice of every local veteran isn't worth displaying because it might offend someone. They've removed photos of our neighbors who died defending our freedom. Where do we draw the line?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. By dawn, the post had been shared 847 times. Comments poured in from military families across northern Illinois, then from veterans groups in Wisconsin and Indiana. The hashtag Remember Riverside Heroes began trending in military circles throughout the Midwest. Margaret arrived at school to find 3 news vans parked outside the main entrance. Channel 7's morning reporter Amanda Chen was interviewing parents as they dropped off their children. Margaret's stomach dropped as she recognized the aggressive stance of crisis journalism cameras thrust forward, microphones extended like weapons, questions designed to provoke rather than inform. She tried to enter through the side door, but Tommy Rodriguez was waiting for her in the hallway, his expression grim. Behind him stood 5 other staff members, including Jennifer Walsh and the school librarian, Mrs. Patricia Kowalski, whose son had served 2 tours in Afghanistan. "Principal Sullivan," Tommy said quietly, "we need to talk." Margaret glanced toward her office, where she could see her secretary, Linda Barnes, fielding phone calls with increasing desperation. The phone hadn't stopped ringing since she'd arrived. "Not now. Tommy, I have reporters outside and a superintendent who wants answers. This is about answers." Tricia Kowalski stepped forward, her usually gentle demeanor replaced by steel determination. Felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Mrs. Kowalski, I've explained the legal concerns don't trump moral obligations," interrupted Mike Davies, the 6th grade teacher whose grandfather had stormed Normandy. "Those photographs represented something sacred to our students and their families. You've turned a tribute into a controversy." The group dispersed as Dr. Henley arrived, his black sedan cutting through the gathering crowd of parents and reporters. Margaret had worked with Henley for 3 years before her promotion, but his expression this morning was unreadable, the practiced neutrality of a career administrator facing a public relations nightmare in her office. With the door firmly closed and blinds drawn, Henley didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Explain to me how a simple policy enforcement turned into a media circus." Margaret had prepared for this moment.
Oh.
But under Henley's scrutiny, her carefully constructed justifications felt inadequate. The veteran display violated several district policies regarding political neutrality. Given recent court cases in similar districts, I felt removal was the safest course of action. Safest for whom? Because right now, we have 3 news stations, 2 newspapers, and a growing social media campaign painting us as anti-military. Henley pulled out his phone, showing her the trending hashtags. "I've had calls from the state superintendent's office, 2 school board members, and a reporter from the Chicago Tribune asking for comment." Through the office windows, they could see the crowd outside growing larger. Parents who'd initially come for regular drop-off were staying, clustering in animated conversations with neighbors and strangers alike. Someone had brought coffee and folding chairs, suggesting this wasn't a spontaneous gathering, sir. "The policy manual clearly states—" "I don't care what the manual states right now, Margaret. I care about managing a crisis that's spiraling beyond our control, Henley moved to the window, peering through the blinds. That's Channel 9 setting up their satellite truck. This story is about to go regional, possibly national. Margaret's phone buzzed with a text from her husband. Saw you on the morning news. Call me. The morning news. She hadn't even known cameras were rolling when she'd hurried into the building. Henley continued, the school board is convening an emergency session for this afternoon. They want recommendations for resolving this situation before it damages the entire district's reputation, the kind that make this story disappear quickly. After Henley left, Margaret tried to focus on regular administrative duties, but normalcy had evaporated. Every phone call was from a reporter or an angry community member. Email flooded her inbox, some supportive, praising her adherence to policy, but many more condemning her decision. The supportive messages came mostly from legal organizations and policy advocates from outside the community. The angry ones came from neighbors. Linda Barnes knocked on her door shortly before lunch. Principal Sullivan, there's a gentleman here to see you. Says his name is Colonel James Morrison, retired. He's not on your schedule, but he says it's urgent. Colonel Morrison stood 6 feet 4 inches tall. His silver hair cropped short in a style that suggested decades of military discipline. Despite his civilian clothes, everything about his bearing screamed career officer. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. Principal Sullivan. I served 32 years in the United States Army. 3 combat deployments, 2 Bronze Stars, and a Purple Heart. I'm also a member of the Illinois Veterans Coalition, representing over 15,000 military families throughout the state. Margaret gestured for him to sit, though he remained standing. I'm here because what happened at this school yesterday has implications far beyond your district. Military families across the region are watching how you handle this situation. Your decision to remove that memorial display has been interpreted as institutional hostility toward military service. Colonel Morrison, I assure you that wasn't my intention. This was strictly a policy compliance issue. Morrison's expression didn't soften. Intentions matter less than actions, Principal Sullivan. Right now, military families throughout Illinois believe their sacrifices are being erased in the name of political correctness. That's a narrative that spreads quickly in our community through her window. Margaret could see the crowd had grown to nearly 50 people. Someone had brought a portable speaker. She could hear the opening notes of the national anthem drifting across the parking lot. What exactly are you asking me to do, Colonel? Restore the display. Publicly acknowledge that honoring fallen heroes isn't a political act, it's a moral obligation. Show military families that their sacrifices still matter to the communities they've done. Margaret felt trapped between competing pressures. Legal liability on one side, community outrage on the other. The district policies exist for a reason. We can't simply ignore legal guidelines because they're unpopular. Morrison leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering to a tone that somehow carried more menace than if he'd shouted. Principal Sullivan, by 5 o'clock tonight, we'll have over 200 military families gathered outside this school. By tomorrow morning, that number could reach 500. By Monday, if this isn't resolved, you could be looking at 1,000 veterans and their families demanding answers. Are you threatening me, Colonel? I'm informing you. Military families communicate differently than civilian communities. We have networks that span states, not just neighborhoods. When one of our own feels attacked, word spreads through channels you can't imagine. This story is already being discussed in VFW halls from Milwaukee to St. Louis. After Morrison left, Margaret sat alone in her office, listening to the growing sounds of protest outside. The national anthem had been replaced by chanted slogans, Honor Our Heroes and Restore the Memorial. Car horns honked in support as drivers passed the school. Her phone rang. Constantly reporters seeking comment, parents demanding explanations. And now calls from veterans organizations she'd never heard of. The story was metastasizing beyond her control, transforming from a local policy dispute into something that felt much larger and more dangerous. At 3:15 p.m., as students began dismissing for the weekend, Margaret watched through her window as parents who'd never spoken to each other before embraced and exchanged phone numbers. A crisis was forging new alliances, creating a community narrative that positioned her as the antagonist in a story about patriotism and respect. Dr. Henley called with an update from the emergency school board meeting. They want options by Monday morning. This thing is growing too fast to contain through normal channels. As the afternoon wore on, Margaret realized that her careful adherence to policy had unleashed forces far beyond district regulations and legal compliance. She was no longer just managing a school. She was at the center of a community's struggle to define its values and identity. The protest outside showed no signs of dispersing as evening approached, and Margaret knew that Colonel Morrison's prediction about growing numbers was probably conservative. What she didn't know was that Sarah Mitchell was already coordinating with military family networks across 3 states, and that a movement was forming that would soon dwarf anything Riverside had ever experienced. Saturday morning brought an unexpected quiet to Riverside Elementary, but Margaret Sullivan knew it was the deceptive calm before a storm. She'd driven to the school despite having no official business there, drawn by a compulsion to see the building without crowds, cameras, and protesters. The empty parking lot felt surreal after Friday's chaos. Someone had chalked messages on the sidewalk overnight. Heroes never forgotten, and restore their honor. A small bouquet of flowers lay beside the main entrance, accompanied by a handwritten note she couldn't read from her car. Her phone had been buzzing since 6 a.m. with calls from numbers she didn't recognize, reporters from Indianapolis, Milwaukee, even one from CNN's Chicago bureau. The story had escaped local containment entirely. Dr. Henley had texted her twice. Media requests are overwhelming. No comments until we meet Monday. But Margaret wasn't prepared for what she discovered when she checked her personal email. Mixed among the expected angry messages was something that gave her pause. A letter from Dr. Elizabeth Hamilton, a constitutional law professor at Northwestern University. Principal Sullivan, the email began. While I understand the community's emotional response to your decision, I want you to know that your interpretation of current jurisprudence is legally sound. The Supreme Court's evolving position on government neutrality in public institutions supports your cautious approach. Don't let public pressure override sound legal reasoning for the first time in days. Margaret felt a flicker of validation. She forwarded the email to Dr. Henley with a brief note. Legal expert confirms our position. His response came within minutes. Legal correctness won't matter if we have 1,000 angry veterans on our doorstep. Politics trumps policy in situations like this. Margaret drove home feeling more isolated than ever. Her husband, Robert, was waiting with coffee and a stack of newspapers. The Chicago Tribune's Metro section featured a prominent article. Suburban Schools Veteran Display. Removal Sparks Community Uprising. The accompanying photo showed Colonel Morrison speaking to a crowd outside the school, his military bearing unmistakable even in civilian clothes. How did this become so complicated? Robert asked, sliding the newspaper across their kitchen table. Margaret scanned the article, noting how the reporter had framed the story. Her careful explanations about legal compliance were reduced to a single paragraph. While emotional quotes from military families dominated the coverage, Sarah Mitchell was quoted extensively. This isn't about politics. It's about honoring neighbors who died serving our country. The law is complicated, Margaret replied, though she was beginning to wonder if legal correctness was sufficient justification for the upheaval she'd unleashed. Sunday brought an escalation that caught everyone off guard. Father Michael O'Brien of St. Catherine's Catholic Church, the largest parish in Riverside, delivered a sermon that directly addressed the controversy. Margaret learned about it secondhand when Jennifer Walsh called her at home. He didn't mention you by name, Jennifer said, her voice carrying a mix of sympathy and warning, but his message was clear. He talked about the biblical obligation to honor those who've sacrificed for others, about communities that lose their moral compass when they prioritize legal technicalities over sacred duties. Margaret closed her eyes, feeling the walls of her position crumbling. Did he encourage people to get involved? He announced that the church would be hosting a prayer vigil Monday evening for military families. He said the community needs to come together to restore what's been lost. St. Catherine's had over 2,000 active parishioners. If even half of them felt motivated by Father O'Brien's call to action, the promised protest would dwarf Colonel Morrison's estimates. Margaret spent Sunday afternoon, researching legal precedents. Hoping to find ammunition for the school board meeting, the cases were indeed complex, with courts reaching different conclusions based on subtle distinctions in displays, context, and community standards. What was legally permissible in rural Texas might not be acceptable in suburban Illinois, but her research also revealed something troubling. Most of the successful challenges to military displays in schools had come from organizations with significant litigation resources. The ACL, Americans United for Separation of Church and State, and similar groups. These organizations specifically targeted emotional community symbols to establish broader legal precedents. Was she protecting the district from a genuine threat? Or was she capitulating to hypothetical concerns that might never materialize? Her contemplation was interrupted by a phone call from her sister in Denver. "Maggie, I just saw you on CNN. What the hell is happening out there?" CNN. Margaret grabbed the remote and found the cable news channel. The story was being covered during their Sunday evening news roundup, positioned as a microcosm of broader cultural tensions between institutional policy and community values. The anchor described it as another example of political correctness clashing with patriotic expression in America's schools. The segment featured interviews with Colonel Morrison and Sarah Mitchell, both articulate and passionate in their defense of the memorial display. Margaret's perspective was represented by a brief statement from Dr. Henley about adherence to district, policy, and legal requirements. She looked weak by comparison, hiding behind bureaucracy while military. Families fought for their fallen heroes. Monday morning arrived with unseasonably warm weather and an atmosphere of impending confrontation. Margaret reached school early, hoping to avoid media attention, but found the parking lot already occupied by news crews from 3 states. Channel 5 from Milwaukee had sent a truck. WGN from Chicago had a reporter doing live stand-ups for their morning show. Inside the building, the staff was split into visible factions. Tommy Rodriguez and the maintenance crew wore small American flag pins on their uniforms. Several teachers had placed photos of military family members on their desks, not violating any explicit policy, but making their position unmistakably clear. Dr. Henley arrived with 2 school board members, Chairman Robert Hayes, a retired bank president, and Vice-Chairman Maria Santos, whose own brother had served in Iraq. Their grim expressions suggested the weekend had brought unwelcome developments. In Margaret's office, Chairman Hayes got straight to business. "We've received over 300 emails since Friday. Phone calls to the district office haven't stopped. The mayor's office is fielding media requests they can't answer." Maria Santos opened her tablet, showing Margaret a Facebook event page. "Support our Riverside Heroes Monday Rally." The page showed 847 people marked as attending and 1,200 more as interested. "These numbers are growing by the hour," Santos explained. Colonel Morrison wasn't exaggerating about military networks. "We're seeing support from veterans groups across the entire Midwest." Dr. Henley leaned forward. "Margaret, we need a solution that allows everyone to save face. The board doesn't want to undermine your authority, but we also can't ignore community sentiment this overwhelming." Margaret felt cornered. "What kind of solution?" Chairman Hayes consulted his notes. "Several options. We could restore the display with additional context about its educational purpose. We could create a new memorial that complies more clearly with legal guidelines. Or we could hold community meetings to develop a compromise everyone can accept. Any of those approaches essentially admits I was wrong," Margaret said. "Not wrong," Maria Santos corrected. "Overly cautious, perhaps. There's a difference." Through the office windows, they could see protesters beginning to gather earlier than expected. The crowd was older than typical school demonstrations, gray-haired veterans in military caps, middle-aged parents with children in tow, and active-duty personnel, still young enough for their uniforms to fit like second skins. Margaret watched a woman in a wheelchair position herself near the main entrance. The placard on her lap read, "My son died in Afghanistan. His memory matters." Beside her, an elderly man in a Korean War veteran Cap held a sign that simply said, "Remember, these weren't professional protesters or political activists. They were neighbors, community members whose lives had been touched by military service and who felt genuinely betrayed by her decision." "How long do I have to decide?" Margaret asked. Hayes checked his watch. "The rally is scheduled for 3:30, right as school dismisses. If we don't have a resolution by then, this situation becomes unmanageable. Too many people, too much media attention, too much emotion." Margaret nodded slowly, realizing that her careful adherence to policy had created exactly the kind of crisis she'd hoped to avoid. Legal correctness was proving insufficient when faced with a community's wounded pride and a 1,000 military families demanding justice for their fallen heroes. Outside, the crowd continued to grow, and Margaret knew that her next decision would determine not just the fate of a memorial display, but her future as an educator and the community's faith in their schools. By 2:30 p.m., the crowd outside Riverside Elementary had swelled beyond anyone's expectations. Margaret watched from her office window as news helicopters circled overhead, their cameras capturing an extraordinary scene. Nearly 1,500 people packed into the school's parking lot and spilling onto adjacent streets. The gathering defied every stereotype of angry protesters. Elderly veterans in wheelchairs sat beside young mothers pushing strollers. Active duty soldiers in dress uniforms stood at attention next to teenagers holding homemade signs. A local Boy Scout troop had arrived in full uniform, their leader explaining to a reporter that they'd come to honor the oath they'd sworn to support. Veterans. Colonel Morrison had positioned himself near the school's main entrance, using a portable microphone to address the crowd. His voice carried across the assembly with military precision. "We're not here to attack anyone. We're here to remind our community that some things are more important than policy." Manuals. Margaret's hands trembled as she reached for her office phone. The decision she'd been avoiding all weekend could no longer be delayed. Every minute that passed brought more media attention, more community division, and more pressure on a situation that had spiraled far beyond her control. Dr. Henley stood beside her desk, fielding calls from the state superintendent's office and the governor's press secretary. The story had achieved exactly the kind of national attention that school districts spent millions trying to avoid. "Channel 12 wants a statement in 10 minutes, he said, hanging up his phone. "Fox News is sending a crew from Chicago. Margaret, we're past damage control now. We need resolution," through the intercom. Linda Barnes announced that students were being dismissed through the rear entrance to avoid the crowd. Parents had been notified via emergency text that pickup procedures were modified. The normal rhythms of school life had been completely disrupted by the controversy Margaret had created. At 3 p.m., Chairman Hayes knocked on her door. Behind him stood the full school board, 5 members who rarely agreed on anything but had reached unanimous consensus that this crisis required immediate action. "We've voted," Hayes announced without preamble. "The memorial display will be restored this afternoon." Margaret felt the words like a physical blow. "You're overruling my decision?" Board member Patricia Fleming, whose husband had served in Vietnam, stepped forward. "We're correcting a mistake before it destroys everything this community has built together. The display goes back up, and you're going to personally apologize to the families affected. I followed district policy. I protected the school from legal liability. You followed the letter of a policy while ignoring its spirit," Fleming replied. "Those photographs weren't political statements. They were tributes to neighbors who died serving their country. The community understands the difference, even if the lawyers don't." Maria Santos opened her tablet, showing Margaret the live stream from outside. The crowd had organized itself with remarkable discipline. Veterans formed honor guards around the families of fallen soldiers. Local high school students were distributing bottled water. Someone had set up a sound system. The assembly was singing "America the Beautiful" in voices that carried across the neighborhood. "Look at them," Santos said. "This isn't about politics or policies. It's about a community's soul. And right now, that community believes their soul has been attacked." Margaret stared at the screen, watching faces that reflected genuine pain and betrayal. These weren't angry protesters demanding unreasonable concessions. They were neighbors who felt their most sacred values had been dismissed by bureaucratic technicalities. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" Chairman Hayes pulled out a prepared statement. "You're going to walk outside, acknowledge that the display removal was an overreaction, and announce its immediate restoration. You're going to apologize specifically to military families who felt dishonored by your decision." Margaret read the statement, each word a small concession of her administrative authority. The language was carefully crafted to preserve some dignity while acknowledging the community's grievances, but it still felt like professional suicide. "If I do this, I'm admitting I was wrong about everything." "You were wrong about what mattered most," Fleming said quietly. "Sometimes good leadership means admitting mistakes and making things right." At 3:25 p.m., Margaret walked toward the school's main entrance, the prepared statement clutched in her sweating palm. Behind her, Tommy Rodriguez carried the carefully wrapped photographs that had started this entire controversy. The crowd fell silent as they emerged. 1,500 pairs of eyes focused on the woman who had become the reluctant center of a national conversation about values, respect, and community identity. Colonel Morrison handed her the microphone, his expression neutral but watchful. Margaret looked out at the sea of faces, some angry, some hopeful, most simply waiting to see if their trust in democratic institutions could be restored. "My name is Margaret Sullivan," she began, her voice carrying across the assembly through speakers that had been set up throughout the parking lot. "I'm the principal of Riverside Elementary, and I owe you an explanation and an apology." A murmur rippled through the crowd, but it quickly settled into attentive silence. "Last week, I made a decision to remove the Veteran Memorial display from our school's main hallway. I believed I was following district policy and protecting our school from potential legal challenges. But in focusing on legal technicalities, I lost sight of something far more important, the values that bind our community together." Margaret paused, looking directly at Sarah Mitchell, whose husband was still deployed overseas. "To the military families who felt dishonored by my decision, I sincerely apologize. The memorial display was never a political statement. It was a tribute to neighbors who made the ultimate sacrifice for all of us." The crowd remained silent, but Margaret could feel a subtle shift in the atmosphere, tension beginning to ease, anger transforming into cautious hope. "Today, we are restoring that display to its rightful place in our school. More importantly, we're committing to creating additional ways to honor military service that bring our community together rather than divide." She nodded to Tommy Rodriguez, who stepped forward with the carefully preserved photographs. One by one, he began unwrapping the images of local veterans' young faces, frozen in time. Heroes whose sacrifices had been temporarily forgotten, but never truly erased. The crowd erupted in applause. But it wasn't triumphant or vindictive. It was the relieved celebration of a community that had rediscovered its shared values after a week of painful division. Colonel Morrison took the microphone back, his voice carrying new warmth. "Principal Sullivan, your willingness to acknowledge mistakes and make them right demonstrates the kind of leadership our military families respect. This community is stronger because you found the courage to do what was right." As the crowd began to disperse, individual families approached Margaret to shake her hand and expressed appreciation for her apology. Sarah Mitchell was among them, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Thank you," Sarah said simply. "My husband will be proud to know his service is honored in his son's school." Over the following hours, as news crews packed their equipment and protesters returned to their normal lives, Margaret found herself in the strange position of being celebrated for reversing a decision that had seemed so administratively sound just a week earlier. Dr. Henley found her in her office that evening, sitting quietly as janitors cleaned up the debris left by a day of extraordinary civic engagement. "How do you feel?" he asked. Margaret considered the question carefully. Humbled, educated, maybe a little wiser about the difference between policy and leadership. The memorial display was restored that evening, occupying its traditional place in the main hallway. But something had changed in the community during the week of controversy. The crisis had forced neighbors to articulate values they'd previously taken for granted, creating new bonds between military and civilian families. Margaret kept her position as principal, but her approach to leadership evolved. She learned to balance legal compliance with community values. Understanding that good administration required more than policy adherence, demanded wisdom, empathy, and the courage to admit when technical correctness had led to moral failure. The story of Riverside Elementary became a case study in graduate education programs, illustrating how institutional policies could clash with community values and how effective leadership required navigating both legal requirements and social expectations. But for the families, whose heroes were once again honored in the school's main hallway, the real lesson was simpler. Democracy works best when communities find the courage to fight for what matters most. And when leaders find the humility to listen when they've lost their way. 3 months after the protest that shook Riverside, Margaret Sullivan stood in the renovated main hallway of the elementary school, watching as contractors put the finishing touches on what had become known as the Heroes Memorial Corridor. What had started as a simple display case had evolved into something far more permanent installation that honored not just local veterans, but active duty service members and their families throughout the region. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. In the weeks following her public apology, Margaret had worked with a community committee to design a memorial that satisfied both legal requirements and community values. The result was a masterpiece of collaborative problem-solving that had attracted attention from school districts across the country. Dr. Amanda Ross from the University of Illinois had arrived that morning to interview Margaret for her doctoral dissertation on crisis management in educational settings. Ross was particularly interested in how the Riverside situation had become a template for resolving similar conflicts elsewhere. Principal Sullivan, Dr. Ross began, settling into the chair across from Margaret's desk. Your case has been cited in 17 different court proceedings as an example of effective community engagement. How did you transform a legal liability into a constitutional showcase? Margaret smiled, remembering her terror during those first chaotic days. I learned that legal compliance and community values don't have to be mutually exclusive. The key was finding creative solutions that honored both. The new memorial corridor was indeed a work of art. Professional displays showcased not just photographs of fallen heroes, but interactive elements that taught students about military history, constitutional principles, and civic responsibility. QR codes linked to video interviews with local veterans. Educational placards explained the legal framework that protected both free speech and religious neutrality in public institutions. Most importantly, the display included a comprehensive disclaimer that clearly identified it as an educational exhibit rather than government endorsement of military action. The disclaimer had been crafted by constitutional law experts and approved by the American Civil Liberties Union, the same organization that had initially threatened to challenge displays like the original one. The irony, Margaret explained to Dr. Ross, is that by engaging with the legal concerns honestly, we created something much more powerful than what we had before. The new memorial actually teaches students about the constitutional principles that protect military service and free expression. Through her office window, Margaret could see the morning ritual that had emerged since the memorial's reopening. Students would pause at the display during their walk to class, many stopping to read about local heroes or scan QR codes for additional information. Teachers incorporated the memorial into history lessons, civics discussions, and writing assignments. Tommy Rodriguez had become an unofficial curator of the display, working with families to ensure that new service members were properly honored and that information remained current. His maintenance duties had expanded to include educational responsibilities that he embraced with the same dedication he'd shown to his military service. The phone rang, interrupting Margaret's interview. Linda Barnes announced that Colonel Morrison was on the line, a call that had become routine over the past several months. Principal Sullivan. Morrison's voice carried its familiar authority, but now it held warmth rather than confrontation. I wanted to confirm the details for next week's Veterans Day ceremony. We've had requests from 6 other school districts to observe and potentially replicate your program. The Veterans Day ceremony had become Riverside Elementary's signature event, drawing visitors from across the Midwest. Unlike traditional assemblies that simply honored military service, Riverside's program engaged students in active learning about constitutional principles, community responsibility, and the complex relationship between military service and democratic values. "Everything's confirmed," Colonel Margaret replied. "We'll have student presentations on the First Amendment, the Establishment Clause, and the difference between honoring individuals and endorsing policies. The kids have been working on this for weeks." After ending the call, Margaret returned to her interview with Dr. Ross. "The unexpected outcome of our crisis was that students became genuinely engaged with constitutional law. They understand nuances that many adults miss: the difference between government endorsement and educational content. Between honoring service and promoting war, the transformation extended beyond the school itself. The community committee that had designed the memorial corridor had evolved into a permanent civic organization focused on veteran affairs and constitutional education. Sarah Mitchell had become its chairwoman, using skills developed during the crisis to advocate for military families throughout northern Illinois. Her husband, Captain David Mitchell, had returned from his deployment to find his community forever changed by the controversy that had erupted in his absence. During a Skype call from Kuwait, he'd watched the protest coverage with amazement, never imagining that his photograph in a school display case could generate such passionate community engagement. "The most remarkable aspect of this case," Dr. Ross noted, consulting her research notes, "is how conflict transformed into collaboration. Most similar controversies result in permanent community division. Riverside achieved something unprecedented, a solution that satisfied legal requirements while strengthening community bonds." Margaret nodded, remembering the early days when she'd felt surrounded by hostile forces. "The breakthrough came when we stopped treating this as a zero-sum conflict. Legal compliance and community values weren't opposing forces. They were both essential elements of effective public education." The success of Riverside's approach had attracted national attention from unexpected quarters. The Military Officers Association of America had recognized the school's memorial corridor as a model for constitutional education. The Anti-Defamation League had praised its approach to balancing religious neutrality with patriotic expression. Even the Freedom from Religion Foundation had acknowledged that the educational framework successfully avoided Establishment Clause violations. Jennifer Walsh knocked on Margaret's door, bringing news that illustrated how completely the situation had transformed. "Principal Sullivan, we just received confirmation that the National Education Association wants to feature our memorial program in their annual conference. They're calling it Constitutional Education through Community Engagement." The recognition was gratifying, but Margaret found more satisfaction in smaller, daily victories. Students regularly approached her with questions about constitutional law, military service, and civic responsibility. Parents had become more engaged with school governance, understanding that their involvement could shape institutional policies. Most importantly, the crisis had demonstrated that democratic institutions could adapt and improve when faced with legitimate community concerns. The school board had revised its policy manual to require community input before implementing changes that affected traditional practices. Legal compliance remained paramount. It now operated within a framework that valued community engagement. Dr. Ross completed her interview by asking about lessons learned. "What would you tell other administrators facing similar situations?" Margaret considered the question carefully. "Don't assume that legal compliance automatically constitutes good leadership. Laws provide minimum standards, but effective administration requires understanding community values and finding creative ways to honor both legal requirements and social expectations." The afternoon brought a surprise visitor that demonstrated how far relationships had evolved. Dr. Elizabeth Hamilton, the Northwestern law professor who had initially supported Margaret's strict policy interpretation, arrived to see the memorial corridor firsthand. "I wanted to apologize," Hamilton said, examining the educational displays. "My initial email focused exclusively on legal risk management. I failed to consider that creative problem-solving could achieve legal compliance while serving community needs, Hamilton had become an advocate for the Riverside approach, citing it in her own constitutional law courses as an example of how legal principles could be implemented with sensitivity to local values. Her students regularly visited the school to observe how theoretical concepts operated in real-world community settings. As the school day ended, Margaret walked through the memorial corridor one final time, observing students and visitors engaging with the displays. The photographs of local heroes remained central to the exhibit, but they were now surrounded by educational content that enhanced rather than diminished their impact. Tommy Rodriguez was adjusting a display panel that featured his own service record alongside explanatory text about veterans' transition to civilian careers. The irony wasn't lost on Margaret. The man whose scarred hands had carefully packed away the original memorial had become instrumental in creating something far more meaningful. The crisis that had threatened to destroy her career had instead transformed her understanding of educational leadership. Legal compliance remained essential, but it operated most effectively when combined with community engagement, creative problem-solving, and the courage to admit mistakes. As Margaret locked her office that evening, she reflected on how completely her perspective had changed. The memorial corridor represented more than restored. Photographs had embodied a community's capacity to transform conflict into collaboration, division into deeper understanding. The story of Riverside Elementary had become a national example of democratic problem-solving, proving that communities could honor their values while respecting constitutional principles, and that effective leadership required both legal knowledge and social wisdom. 1 year after the protest that changed everything, Margaret Sullivan received a phone call that would define the ultimate legacy of the Riverside Elementary controversy. The caller was General Patricia Williams, the highest-ranking female officer in the Illinois National Guard, with news that Margaret never could have anticipated during those dark October days. Principal Sullivan: I'm calling to inform you that Riverside Elementary has been selected to receive the National Guard's Community Partnership Award. Your school's memorial corridor and educational program have become the gold standard for military-civilian engagement in educational settings. Margaret sat in stunned silence as General Williams continued. We've studied your approach extensively. 17 school districts across 7 states have implemented similar programs based on your model. More importantly, you've demonstrated that constitutional principles and community values can coexist when leadership has the courage to find creative solutions. The award ceremony would take place at the Pentagon, with Margaret and her team invited to present their program to military education specialists from across the country. It was recognition that she'd never imagined possible during the crisis that had nearly ended her career. But the most meaningful transformation wasn't happening in Washington. It was occurring daily in the hallways of Riverside Elementary, where something unprecedented had emerged from the ashes of community conflict. The school had become a pilgrimage site for educators, constitutional scholars, and military families seeking to understand how polarized communities could bridge their differences. Dr. Janet Morrison, Margaret's former professor from graduate school, arrived that morning with a delegation from the American Association of School Administrators. Margaret, Dr. Morrison said, embracing her former student, when you were in my program 10 years ago, I never imagined you'd become the architect of a new model for democratic education. Your crisis management has literally rewritten textbooks. The morning tour began in the memorial corridor, but it now encompassed the entire school. The constitutional education program had expanded into every grade level, with students learning about democratic principles through real-world applications rather than abstract textbook concepts. 5-year-old kindergartners learned about community responsibility by creating thank you cards for local veterans. Third graders studied the Bill of Rights by examining how different amendments protected military families, religious freedom, and free expression. Eighth graders engaged in mock constitutional conventions, debating the balance between government authority and individual rights. Most remarkably, The students had become teachers themselves. The Riverside Youth Civics Corps, comprised of 4th through 8th graders, regularly presented their constitutional education program to visiting delegations. Their presentations were more compelling than those of most adult educators, combining deep understanding with genuine enthusiasm. 12-year-old Emma Rodriguez, Tommy's daughter, had become the program's unofficial spokesperson. Her presentation to the morning delegation demonstrated how completely the next generation had internalized the lessons of their community's crisis. A year ago, our school faced a hard choice, Emma explained to the visiting administrators. Follow rules that seem to dishonor our heroes, or break rules that were designed to protect everyone's rights. We learned that smart people can find solutions that honor both. Margaret watched with pride as Emma fielded sophisticated questions about constitutional interpretation, separation of powers, and the role of community engagement in democratic institutions. The crisis had created a generation of young citizens who understood civics at a level that shamed most adults. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor who represented the full circle of transformation. Dr. Charles Brennan, son of the school's previous principal, had driven from Indianapolis, where he worked as a federal judge. His father, Harold Brennan, had passed away 6 months earlier. Never seeing the resolution of the controversy that began shortly after his retirement, Principal Sullivan, Judge Brennan said, "My father would have been amazed by what you've accomplished here. He spent 38 years avoiding controversy, trying to keep everyone happy. You faced controversy head-on and transformed it into something beautiful." Judge Brennan had come to see the memorial corridor that had evolved from his father's simple display case. The original photographs remained, but they were now part of a comprehensive educational experience that had attracted attention from the Supreme Court's Education Committee. "The legal community is watching what you've done here," he explained. "You've proven that church-state separation doesn't require hostility toward religious or patriotic expression. You found the sweet spot that protects constitutional principles while serving community values." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a tour bus carrying military families from Fort Campbell, Kentucky. Colonel Morrison had organized monthly visits for service members and their families to observe Riverside's program and consider similar initiatives for schools near their installations. Among the visitors was Master Sergeant Lisa Chen, whose own school district in Tennessee was facing a controversy similar to Riverside's original crisis. She'd come specifically to understand how legal compliance could be achieved without community alienation. "We're dealing with the exact same situation," Chen explained to Margaret. "Our principal removed a POW MIA flag from the school entrance, citing separation concerns. The community is furious, but the legal department is adamant. How do we find middle ground?" Margaret spent an hour walking Chen through the Riverside process, the initial missteps, the community engagement strategies, the creative legal solutions, and the collaborative design process that had produced their current program. But most importantly, she emphasized the mindset shift that had made everything possible. "The breakthrough came when we stopped seeing this as an adversarial situation," Margaret explained. "Legal compliance and community values weren't enemies. They were both essential elements of good public education. Our job was to find solutions that honored both." The late afternoon brought Margaret's favorite part of each school day, the informal conversations with students who had become genuinely excited about constitutional law and civic engagement. Today's group included 6th grader Marcus Washington, whose grandfather had served in Vietnam, and 7th grader Sophia Martinez, whose mother was currently deployed in Germany. "Mrs. Sullivan," Marcus asked, "why don't other schools teach about the Constitution like we do? It's actually interesting when you understand how it affects real people." The question highlighted what Margaret considered her greatest achievement. The constitutional education program hadn't just resolved a community crisis, it had created a generation of students who understood democratic principles as living, breathing concepts rather than abstract historical artifacts. Sophia raised her hand with a follow-up question. "Do you think what happened here could work in other places?" Like, if communities got really mad about something, could they figure out solutions like we did? Margaret smiled, remembering her own uncertainty during those chaotic October days. Democracy works best when people are willing to listen to each other, even when they disagree. What happened here proves that communities can solve problems together if they focus on shared values instead of their differences. As the school day ended, Margaret walked through the memorial corridor one final time, observing the daily miracle that had emerged from crisis. Students clustered around the interactive displays, veterans chatted with teachers about upcoming classroom presentations, and parents lingered to read the constitutional explanations that accompanied the memorial. Photographs. The evening mail brought a letter that captured the full significance of Riverside's transformation. It was from Dr. Elena Vasquez, professor at Harvard Law School who specialized in First Amendment issues. Principal Sullivan, the letter began. I wanted to express my admiration for what you've accomplished at Riverside Elementary. Your approach to balancing Establishment Clause concerns with community values has become required reading in my constitutional law courses. You've demonstrated that legal principles can be implemented with wisdom and sensitivity. Dr. Vasquez's. A letter included an invitation for Margaret to speak at Harvard's annual symposium on education law. Recognition that would have seemed impossible during the dark days when she'd feared for her career and her community's unity. But the true measure of success wasn't academic recognition or national awards. It was found in the daily interactions between students, teachers, families, and community members who had learned that democratic institutions could adapt and improve when faced with legitimate concerns. As Margaret prepared to leave her office, she paused at the framed photograph on her desk-scan image from the protest that had changed everything. 1,500 people had gathered that day, united by frustration and a sense that their values were under attack. Their anger had been real, their concerns legitimate, and their passion undeniable. But what made Riverside's story unique wasn't the protest itself, it was what happened next. Instead of permanent division, the community had chosen collaboration. Instead of victor and vanquished, they had created shared victory. Instead of legal compliance or community values, they had achieved both. The phone rang one final time, bringing news that perfectly symbolized how completely everything had changed. It was Sarah Mitchell, calling to report that her husband's unit had requested copies of Riverside's constitutional education materials for use in military family readiness programs. Overseas, Captain Mitchell says your program is exactly what military kids need, Sarah explained. Understanding that serving your country and respecting the Constitution aren't separate things there. The same thing. As Margaret turned off her office lights and walked through the empty hallways of Riverside Elementary, she reflected on the journey that had transformed her understanding of leadership, law, and community. The memorial corridor glowed softly in the evening light, its educational displays standing as testament to the power of democratic problem-solving. The crisis that had threatened to destroy her career had instead revealed her purpose. She wasn't just a school administrator enforcing policies, she was a community leader helping citizens navigate the complex intersection of law, values, and democratic participation. The story of Riverside Elementary had become proof that American communities could still find common ground, that constitutional principles and local values could coexist, and that effective leadership required not just legal knowledge, but the wisdom to understand when rules serve communities and when communities must shape rules. Margaret Sullivan had learned that democracy isn't about avoiding controversy. It's about transforming controversy into collaboration, division into understanding, and conflict into the kind of creative solutions that make communities stronger than they were before. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.